In this video, I'm going to give you a brief tutorial on how to solve a quadratic equation. So first of all, here's a basic quadratic equation. I have x squared minus 5x plus 6 equals 0. And the method I'm going to use to solve this is to factor it. Well, here's some steps in order to solve it. First of all, when we're solving a quadratic equation, we need to make sure, no matter what method we're using, that we have equals 0. When we're solving with the quadratic equation, which I'll have a tutorial on that later, you have to make sure you set it equal to 0. When you factor, you set it equal to 0, all because of the lovely zero product property, which says if a times b equals 0, then either a or b equals 0. That's where it's based off of. And plus, if you take a look at the proof of the quadratic equation, you'll see that initially you have to get it equal to 0. So here's what I'm going to do. First of all, I got it equal. Second, I'm going to factor. And so to factor, I'm going to show a little bit different method than what I've done in previous videos. So first of all, I'm going to show you this called PSN. And here's what it stands for. P is for product, S is for sum, and N is for, spell that right, number. And here's what it stands for. If you saw my other video about splitting the middle, what you do first is you multiply A times C. That's how we start, by factoring. And that's what product stands for. So we're going to multiply A times C and get 6. Next, sum. So if you remember sum, I had to think of two numbers that multiplied to be 6, yet added to be negative 5. And that's what sum stands for. It's the B term of the quadratic. And while this numbers, what are the two numbers that multiply to be 6, yet add to be negative 5? Well, that's going to be negative 2 and negative 3. So from here, we're going to factor. Here's the lovely part about it. A is 1, meaning that this factors to be x minus 2 times x minus 3. If A is 1, then we can simply factor it to this. If it's not 1, then you have to split the middle and do all that extra stuff that goes with it. And I'll show you an example of that in just a moment. So that was step 2. Step 3, what I'm going to do is set each factor equal to 0. So again, using the zero product property, since this whole thing multiplies to be 0, that means either x minus 2 equals 0 or x minus 3 equals 0. And hopefully, if you're watching this, you know how to solve this already. We add 2 to both sides, I add 3 to both sides, and so I get x equals 2 and x equals 3. And so what I've done is I found the zeros of this particular quadratic. Now you can call it zeros, you can call it roots, you can call it solutions. It all means the same thing. We're trying to, well, kind of, where we're trying to solve that quadratic. And so if I were to plug this in, I would get 0. Let's look at one more case. It's a little bit more complicated. Here I've got 3x squared equals 16x plus 12. Now if you remember from the first step, when we flip back, the first step was to get the equation equal to 0. So to do that, I'm going to manipulate this equation a little bit. Just out of personal preference, I like to keep my a positive. So since here I have 3x squared, I want to keep that positive. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to subtract 16x, and I'm going to subtract 12 from both sides. So this becomes 3x squared minus 16x minus 12 equals 0. So this is what I mean when we get it equal to 0. And from here what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor. So again, I'll use PSN. So I look for my product. So I multiply A and C, so it gives me negative 36. And my sum is negative 16. So I had to think what two numbers multiply to be negative 36, yet add to be negative 16. Well, the solution to that is negative 18 and 2. Multiply to be negative 36, add to be negative 16. So from here, since my A is 3, I'm going to have to split the middle. So this becomes 3x squared minus 18x plus 2x minus 12 equals 0. So if you remember, we then go ahead and group. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to factor out the greatest common factor from each of these. So here I'm going to take out, let's see, it looks like 3x. So I'm going to have 3x times, I'm left with x minus 6. Here I'm going to take out a 2. So that's x minus 6 equals 0. Then to finish it all off, I put these two together. So I get, let's see, that would be 3x plus 2 times x minus 6. And you're having trouble with where this is coming from, you can go watch one of my other videos on how to factor. Now, since I have this completely factored, I'm going to set each of these, so 3x plus 2, equal to 0. So 3x plus 2 equals 0, and x minus 6 equals 0. Now, I solve. So from here, I subtract 2, I divide, so x equals negative 2/3, and from here, I'm going to add, so I have x equals 6, and there are my solutions. So that's a brief tutorial on how to solve basic quadratic equations. Remember, we get the equation equal to 0, factor each part, set each factor equal to 0, and then solve each part. And, well, if this doesn't work, you can watch my other video on how to solve a quadratic equation using the quadratic formula.